What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I think it probably makes sense to start with Nightmare, which I would consider not necessarily the baseline deck of the metagame, but largely the you must be this tall to ride, based on play rate at high infinite and general popularity. This is a deck that people are going to see a decent amount of, and it has a fairly flat but very high point output ratio. Now, the specifics of the deck are going to vary. There are normal Sauron decks that are not playing Nightmare, which are largely getting not necessarily stat checked, but just like Nightmare checked by the Nightmare versions of these decks. And I think largely what's happening here is 0 people approximately are playing the recently nerfed Shang-Chi, which means that this is just a very safe kind of deck to play right now. You are not getting predated upon the way you previously were by the bad man, and so you can just get a lot of value out of this kind of stuff. But I will note that the other thing that is happening is that cards like Mobius and Stardust are helping to keep this deck's biggest predators out of the metagame. A deck that is this good or this consistent relies on cards existing that prevent things that go massively taller than it from outflanking it, like Mr. Negative, for example, or Hela. And largely, those decks still have answers in the metagame, which means that this deck gets a little bit more free reign than it otherwise would. So I think largely this is a good deck to start with because it's setting the tone. Another tone setter is Clug, and Clug is a very straightforward and powerful list that has a bunch of different variations. We'll show off some very specific variations of both Clug and the Nightmare deck a little bit later that are being used at the tippy top of Infinite, but I think this is the Clug list you're gonna want to prepare for. And I say that because it is a very clear and straightforward decision that if I no longer have access to reactive tech cards that make my opponent's plays not happen, I need to make my opponent's plays not happen proactively. If there was a downside to a tech nerf, it is that there are still plenty of ways to make that happen, and they don't all, in fact, involve a billion numbers, but many, in fact, involve strategies like this instead. And I think that this is a fundamentally more fair thing to have in the metagame than, say, a bunch of turn 6, boom, ba-boom, ba-boom, nothing you did mattered, but it's also a lot less fun because it face up prevents you from doing what you want to do with your deck. So while I think it's more balanced, I think it is probably a little bit of a net loss on fun that this is now what is policing the metagame in some way as compared to the previous metagame police that recently got nerfed. Speaking of metagame police, one of the funniest things that happened in this OTA is that I tried a bunch of like, oh, let's go back to the combo IW stuff and we need that to keep up. And it was all fine, and then I just went back to the same exact 12 cards that I've been playing this whole time, and it was better. Yeah, I don't know either. It's incredible how they nerf all of these decks, and suddenly we just have the exact same 12 cards. It's just perfectly functional. This deck actually can deal with a lot of what the metagame is throwing at it just by virtue of having A, Mobius, B, Stardust, and C, the Thing First Steps and Juggernaut. I realize that last bit is a little bit of a cop-out because it's 2 things on 1 entry, but what those cards let you do effectively is just steal some games. It doesn't really matter what your opponent is doing if they're having their things blown up or not be where they want them to be. And so this deck can be in a game with basically anything. It doesn't really matter how big their opponent's output is. It doesn't really matter that we don't have a Shang-Chi. It can matter, but with this kind of stuff, Juggernaut is, honestly, I would say probably an even more prominent card than he was before the changes. And I think you would probably want to look into Senor Juggernuts if you want to build mid-rangey decks right now. So with a lot of Clug around, with a premium on big numbers, it is no surprise that Move Bounce is a very reasonable deck. This is a deck that has multiple inbuilt outs to Clug in the form of the cards that are being bounced. It has the ability to create extremely massive human torches that drastically outscale anything a Nightmare deck can do. It can make numbers that are very big, but it is, in my opinion, very reliant on Human Torch to do that. If you are not doing something stupid with Human Torch, there is a massive gap in your output. Dagger is cool, but Dagger is not beating a bunch of 10s in a location. Human Torch is beating a bunch of 10s in a location. And that means that this deck very much does kind of live and die on the torch here. It is very much about Johnny Storm and what he is able to do. And if you have him going, and God forbid, if you copy him, you're probably beating basically anything in the metagame. Having a sort of incredibly snappable nut draw against almost everything anyone is playing is good, but having so much of your power wrapped up in actually having access to it, you can definitely lose some games with this deck that'll feel pretty frustrating. Before we move into what I would consider probably a little bit more of tier 2, I want to talk about a couple of high infinite alts on some of the previous decks that we talked about. This is Smiles' build of Sauron that is effectively what you would describe as Sauron plus Tech. So what's going on here is largely that Juggernaut is really good. And if you want to win mirrors, having a final turn Juggernaut plus a 3 energy Scar is a really strong thing to do. So this deck is trying to make that happen. Against the 10s decks, you can have a lot of inbuilt advantages by having your cards do things that are powerful. I already talked about how good Juggernaut is. I would not be surprised if something like this ended up being an incredibly powerful choice for a decent portion of this metagame, barring things getting much taller. This is Butt's build of Clog, and it is built to clog as fast as possible. Debris with Silver Surfer first steps is a lot of clogging, and it's the kind of clogging that someone who is, say, playing Annihilus can't really do much about. What this deck wants to do is accelerate a bunch of Clog onto the board, have a Strange Supreme to prevent that Clog from being relevant to them, and then just largely figure out how to win whatever other lane thanks to Omega Sentinel and Cannonball. It is a deck that will ask you to snap aggressively because by the time you've done your thing, they will realize they are very unable to play cards. And it's generally pretty good to play cards in your game of playing cards, so they're probably going to leave. You got to be pretty aggressive with this one. This is effectively an alt on move bounce, and I bring it up to say that like there's not really a good reason why people are playing move bounce right now. I mean, like I talked about the reasons in the context of this metagame. Like, yeah, you could do a bunch of big stuff, right? Like it's cool. I think mostly people are playing move bounce because it wasn't nerfed, and this deck, even though it was better before, lost Cosmo and Eliath. But the reason it played Cosmo and Eliath was to protect it from all the other cards that just got nerfed. Nobody's playing Shadow King. Nobody's playing Shang-Chi. We don't need those cards in the first place. And if this deck was better before than Move Bounce was, I don't understand why it wouldn't be better after, because yeah, 2 of the cards in it got nerfed, but also the reason we needed to play them in the first place got nerfed. And I'm kind of like, I'm not going to say like I predict this, because predicting the future is a fool's errand. But I would not be surprised if the conclusion eventually was, yeah, people were underrating this because it did get nerfed and overrating move bounce because it didn't get nerfed, and just sort of didn't really fully walk through that logic train here. Because I honestly think I would not be surprised if this ended up being the better version of move right now. I feel like in games where I don't draw Human Torch, I am much more able to play a mid-range role. In games where I do draw Human Torch, nobody's interacting with him anyway. Who cares? And the whole point of move bounce is, oh God, I'm so terrified of interaction. I got to throw priority. I don't want to throw priority right now. There's a bunch of juggernauts running around. Stop it. I don't want to throw priority. I want to have priority. I want to not get juggernauted meaningfully. Like, I kind of think there's a lot of upside to playing big move instead of move bounce, but largely I think people are much more comfortable going to move bounce because, well, it didn't get nerfed. So one card that you don't want to see if you decide to be a Hela gamer is Stardust. The IWFS decks are definitely still playing that card. And generally, I would say a lot of the time, you are very comfortable saying, I'm going to go over the top of a group of 10s. But Hela's always been a little bit closer to the ground than some of the real big combo decks, and you might find yourself relying a little bit more on combinations of cards. Like, oh, I have my Corvus and I have my Hela in the same lane, and then I Ode in that lane. And that's how I get more points than the deck that is just playing a bunch of 10s, right? Because honestly, your output is very, 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 very big, but it's not as big relative to what everyone else is doing as it normally would be. Hela often occupies a metagame space that is defined by the cards that just got nerfed. Hela wants to be the deck that beats the cards that just got nerfed, because those cards are what keep the point output of the metagame low enough for Hela to beat everything else. And so it beats that, and then those decks beat the decks that would beat Hela, but that dynamic isn't really happening right now, which is not to say Hela is a bad choice, but it does mean that you have to like sort of re-examine like, oh, am I actually seriously supposed to do this? Did my opponent just make a 40 power Human Torch and then Frigga it? Am I just dead to that every single time? No, obviously you hit it with a Gambit 1 out of 8 every single time, but there are more things that are able to reach your level is largely the thing that is sticking out to me about Hela. I had 2 ongoing lists, both of which I think were solid, that I were really competing for 1 slot on this tier list. And I ended up going for the more simplistic ongoing deck here. I'm not sure it holds up. Like, there are certain considerations to be made, but like just fundamentally, doing points is good, and I'm generally happy when I am able to do this. I like being a Mobius deck. I like, this sort of operates in a similar space to the IWFS decks to me, I think. And I think those are relatively well positioned. I miss Cosmo, and I want to get him back in here. I'm just not sure how. I've also seen a lot of people doing like Moonstone V-Hand Bastion overlap stuff where you're like Quinjetting your Moonstone. And it's just like, I get it, but I don't buy it. I just don't think that that is a better build of the ongoing deck than just playing the normal ongoing deck. And I'm not positive this is the best build of ongoing. I'd actually be kind of interested in maybe revisiting the Iron Man anti-venom kind of build from way back in the day where we were just like putting 80 points of power in a Moonstone lane or whatever. That kind of stuff sounds pretty appealing to me. But I do think that there is a place for ongoing based decks like this in this new metagame. All right, let's talk about some all-in combo piles. This is a very straightforward Wong deck. If you get Juggernauted, you cry yourself to sleep. If you get Enchantress, you can potentially cry yourself to sleep. There are a bunch of people who are trying like various Lady Deathstrike tech decks. You might want to cry yourself to sleep when that happens. But in the world where your cards actually work, you are making a lot of big numbers. I do think it's notable that in the absence of these tech cards, a lot of people are playing, you know, here's my garbagey Lady Deathstrike mid-range decks. I'm also people in this case. I don't want to like make it seem like it's something I'm not doing. But it's like, all right, well, what are we going to interact with? Because I can't just let these guys do this to me. And it's right. You can't, right? If you just let these guys do this to you, this turns into Grand Arena. The Wong people just make 10 million points, and you just sit there looking at them like, man, I really wish I had a card. So you do have to pay your due respects to this deck. It's just also, if you pay your due respects to it, you're taking them for 4 or 8. One of the things I've been pretty clear about really liking about this patch is that I like that they didn't nerf Mobius and Stardust, because I think if they did, this metagame would be almost infinitely worse, right? When you look at what do we play in the absence of tech cards, the answer is almost always whatever goes the tallest. So getting rid of the tech cards that prevent this from being everywhere would have been a really bad idea. Getting rid of the tech cards that prevent Nimrod from being everywhere would have been a really bad idea. And so I think that this is largely a deck that, while it is good at beating up all of the tech cards, or all of the decks that are now free thanks to the nerf of the tech cards, I do think that there's just enough people playing straightforward Mobius decks that it might not just be a good choice. Like, the fact that they left Mobius unnerfed is what is preventing this deck from running over every single thing that we've talked about so far. Every deck that we've talked about would be unviable if Mobius didn't exist and wasn't being run in these decks. It would be about that. And I'm really happy they didn't do that, because obviously Mr. Negative's point total is ridiculous. One little fun wrinkle is the Shang-Chi in here, because frankly, there are so many Sauron gamers. There are so many people playing 10s. They're like, I'm free from Shang-Chi. No, you're not. You're not free from Shang-Chi. Actually, I'm still going to Shang-Chi you, and it's going to cost 2. Speaking of absolutely losing to Mobius M. Mobius, this is absolutely a good way to lose to Mobius M. Mobius if you want to. You can indeed dominate everyone if your deck works, and then if you get Mobius, you can leave and cry salty, salty, salty tears. It's a good enough deck. I think largely my issue is that it kind of exists in the same space as Mr. Negative, where it's like, well, if I do get Mobius, I instantly die. And if I don't get Mobius, they probably leave, right? Like this, the only thing you have going for you is that everyone leaves on Mr. Negative stuff, and you might be able to get away with people not knowing what this is. But mostly it's a difference of cube equity because the same situations are the things you run up against. Your endgame is not as good as Mr. Negative's, but you make up for it by having a relatively better normal output thanks to stuff like Esme, having a lot of really powerful hits in a deck like this, and having a sort of point floor that you have access to. There's good stuff to be said about a list like this. I don't know how much more justifiable than Mr. Negative it is, outside of just people maybe respect Mr. Negative a lot more than they do this. I really expected Ladder Tribunal to be like a better deck in the context of this metagame, but a couple things are really pushing against it. The first is I'm starting to see a conclusion among high-level players that Enchantress actually got buffed. And not to be like, haha, I totally called it about that, but also like, I did totally call that. I did actually call that one. And frankly, she's just showing up in a lot of different places. And especially the fact that the Sauron deck is playing her in all of them. All of them are playing Enchantress. It just kind of leaves this deck looking really, really awkward. Now, outside of that, there's another thing pushing against it, which is, I know we have Misery. Like, I get it. There are technically less games we are dead to Clug than other Tribunal decks. But also, we're so dead to Clug. We are so heinously dead to Clug. I get it. There's a Misery. Maybe we'll be able to like scam a couple 4 to 8s out of them. But like, whoa, are we dead to Clug? Now, this deck does manage to dodge Mobius pretty well, which I think is good. It is good that it dodges Mobius. It's not a Sarah deck. It's just like, oh, here's some numbers. I'm going to like get my energy the old fashioned way. You know, heartwarming Wiccan deck gains energy, or Tribunal deck gains energy the old fashioned way, right? Doesn't get Mobius. It's nice. It's nice. You know, this 100-year-old diner still makes Coke the old fashioned way. That's how it feels right now to play this deck. I don't know that it's enough, but I do know that I like this build a lot more than pretty much any of the other builds of Tribunal right now. When I put the old band back together for the IWFS deck, I thought largely it was because I didn't get enough out of being all in on combo. It turns out you can just be even more all in on combo with the Honifer build, which is actually doing well for probably the first time ever. This is something that he was pretty... Hold on a second. And that's not a slight on the build per se. It's just been missing a linchpin card, and that card is Bastion. What this deck wants to do is do something. It picks one game plan, and it does it to the absolute maximum. And it was just Frigga allowing you to do it to the absolute maximum. I think it ended up falling behind. But with Bastion allowing you to do these game plans even harder, look at all of my Dakins and Bullseyes and whatnot. There is something to be said for this deck as just a pure stat output monster. It is legit. And while I think a lot of what I would say about this deck does apply to the discard build of the deck as well, this deck just has more stuff that's really stupid to copy. And that's sort of the premise here. Your job is to do A plus A. You get your multiplication on your Invisible Woman, cards that scale with each other. Hopefully you can get up to like 3 of them. I don't really think you can, but it is technically possible. You go Bastion, you play a 2/3 Dakin, you copy the Dakin with the Frigga, you get another Dakin. Things are pretty stupid once that happens, right? Now, it is very disjointed. The deck is extremely disjointed and requires you to commit very early, which means I don't know if it's the right move for everyone, but there is a lot of power here. I guess you don't need multiple bullseyes. Did I say bullseyes or Dakins? Am I stupid? I'm an idiot. Whatever. People are going to call me an idiot on the video, and it's chill. They do that anyway. Couple of tech garbage decks. Consider these the last gasp of those who were so addicted to Shang-Chi and Shadow King. It makes me feel like Immortan Joe. Do not, my friends, get addicted to water. This is what it'll do to you. Now, this is a deck built by Derek, and I respect Derek as a player greatly, but when I played this deck, it was a little bit subpar, is what I will say. The deck is really good when you draw Merlin and Werewolf, and then when you don't draw Merlin and Werewolf, you just sit there looking at all of your cards, realizing you have absolutely no way to curve out. But Merlin Werewolf, I am very compelled by. I'm with this deck as far as Merlin Werewolf, just the kind of everything else around it. It's a very Derek deck where it's like, I'm going to win 2 lanes by a grand total of 4 points. Like, that's the kind of mindset you have to have when you play this. I also think that, like, largely the increase in Nightmare decks just leaves this deck in a very awkward spot where it's like, this deck is not built to take on a Nightmare. It's not built for that, big dog. And so you just sit there, you play your 4/7, you play your 5/7 Lady Deathstrike. It's like, that's awesome, man. And then they play like a 5/14 that's a claw as well as being a Red Skull. And you're just like, oh yeah, that beats my entire deck. That's just too big for me. Another tech pile iteration here. And I know it sounds weird to call these tech piles, but I'm just going to let you in on a little secret. In the modern era, as long as this patch is over, or as long as this patch is functioning, what we call tech pile is just Negasonic Juggernaut. Like that's what tech is, right? You have Negasonic Juggernaut, you have maybe Lady Deathstrike, but like that's what's going on here, right? Like that's what this is. This is saying, all right, well, we lost some of what we do, but however, have you considered your thing got blown up and also I juggernauted you? That's it. Like that's the whole thing, man. There's the I think you could also very reasonably call the Invisible Woman First Step stuff a tech pile, but I think really we should all be writing Invisible Woman First Step stuff a thank you note for policing the stuff that really sucks, like Hela and Mr. Negative out of the metagame by being a Mobius Stardust deck and allowing decks like this to generally flourish. But yeah, this is a Juggernaut deck. Like, you're going to see a lot of Juggernaut decks. They're around. I do fear that, unfortunately, Wiccan has a problem with Nightmare that it is just sort of fundamentally unable to solve. This deck is not built for the moment. It's cool, but it has no way to go over the top of anything. If your opponent is trying to, say, make a big Human Torch, well, they get to do that and you lose to it, right? If they are playing a bunch of 10s, they get to do that and you probably lose to it, right? Like, it's a little bit awkward, but I would consider this more an alternate on the sort of, I get to be a Mobius tech deck kind of thing. This is more comparable to the Invisible Woman First Step stuff to me. I just think the Invisible Woman First Step stuff does a little bit better of a job occupying this space. I would love to believe in Zoo. I can't really believe in Zoo. I would love to, though. Like, yo, they nerfed Killmonger. Let's play some Zoo. Yeah. It's a Clug meta. It's a Nightmare 10s meta. You don't have enough stats. You just get relentlessly beaten down. Even like I've had games where it's like, the thing about Zoo is it's so good at contesting 3 locations, but so many decks right now are better than you at contesting 2, right? You can lose to the thing First Steps, just hitting a guy that is like vaguely important to you, right? You can lose to Cannonball. You can lose to just like a bunch of stuff that's just there and goes tall in 2 locations. And you've output 57 power for the game, but like 14 of it is in a location where it doesn't matter. And then you lose the 2 locations that do matter by like a combined 4 power. And like, that's the perennial experience of playing Zoo, I fear. Normally, this is where we talk about Destroy. Instead, we're going to talk about another mediocre all-in deck, Discard. And I don't mean the good version with the Swarms. I do think the Swarm Dakin stuff, especially if you're going to play Bastion in it, pretty great Bastion deck, pretty solid at doing numbers, some really powerful stuff in there. You can compete with a lot of stuff just by making a bunch of points. Very, 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 very valid. This deck, on the other hand, gets so unbelievably pounded by just the fact that it has a limited ceiling for itself. What this deck was good at was middling a metagame where the output of other decks was limited by tech cards that didn't necessarily negatively impact this. In other words, this was a deck that Shang-Chi was keeping safe, because it's really bad to be a Shang-Chi deck and your opponent has a gigantic Dracula. You can't Shang-Chi that. That's bad. But you can Shang-Chi a lot of stuff that would have similar points to this deck, and those decks are now running wild. In addition, if you're trying to be an interactive deck right now, there's a decent chance you are playing cards like Cosmic Ghost Rider and Lady Deathstrike that got moved up the like sort of relative chain of command here, and both of those obliterate you. And so you end up with a deck that a lot of people are playing, Just One Golden Gauntlet, totally different context here. The exact same 12 cards, but a totally different context, and that context is very bad for this deck. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest, you have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.